The winter of 1952 was the harshest Montana had seen in decades, with temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero and snowdrifts piling 8 feet high against barn doors. Most folks stayed inside by their fires, but in the old stables behind Murphy's feed store in Cedar Falls, a woman named Sarah Mitchell was preparing for what might be her final night alive. She had been living in those abandoned stables for 3 weeks, surviving on scraps from the diner's trash bins and melted snow for water. Her threadbare coat, once navy blue, had faded to the color of old bruises, and her boots had holes that let in the Montana cold like cruel whispers. What happened next would change not just her life, but expose a web of corruption that reached from the town's wealthiest family all the way to the state capital. But before we dive into how a homeless woman's desperate fight for survival uncovered one of Montana's biggest political scandals, we need to understand how Sarah Mitchell went from being a respected teacher to sleeping in horse stalls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the stable, pulling her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders as another gust of wind rattled the loose boards above her head. 3 weeks ago, she had been living in a modest apartment on Elm Street, teaching 4th grade at Cedar Falls Elementary School, with enough money for groceries and even the occasional movie ticket. Tonight, she was calculating whether the small pile of kindling she'd gathered would last until morning, or if she'd have to choose between staying warm and staying alive. The transformation from respected educator to homeless vagrant hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened fast enough to leave Sarah's head spinning. It started with a budget meeting at the school district office on a Tuesday morning in early November. Sarah had been teaching for 12 years, long enough to know when something wasn't right with the numbers being presented to the faculty. The state education funding has been reduced by 30%. Superintendent William Crawford had announced to the assembled teachers, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the worried faces around the conference table. "We're going to have to make some difficult personnel decisions." Sarah had studied the budget documents Crawford distributed, her mathematics background making the discrepancies obvious. The numbers didn't add up. According to her calculations, the funding reduction was closer to 8%, not 30%. Someone was skimming money from the education budget, but confronting the superintendent directly would require more evidence than gut instinct and mental arithmetic. Over the next week, Sarah spent her evenings at the school, ostensibly grading papers, but actually photographing budget documents and comparing them to state funding reports she'd requested from the Montana Department of Education. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Nearly $200,000 in education funding was being diverted from its intended purpose. But the money trail disappeared into a maze of shell companies and consulting contracts that would require forensic accounting to untangle. The smart thing would have been to take her evidence to the authorities quietly. But Sarah Mitchell had never been accused of being overly cautious. Instead, she decided to present her findings at the next school board meeting, believing that transparency would force immediate corrective action. She prepared meticulously, organizing her evidence into clear, undeniable proof of financial irregularities that demanded investigation. The school board meeting on November 20th was standing room only, unusual for a town where civic engagement typically meant complaining about potholes at the diner. Sarah had requested time to address the board, and her presentation was scheduled after routine business. She sat in the front row, a manila folder containing copied documents, and her analysis resting on her lap like a loaded weapon. When her name was called, Sarah approached the podium with the confidence of someone who believed truth would triumph over corruption. Her voice was steady as she began explaining the discrepancies she'd discovered, displaying charts and financial documents that painted a clear picture of systematic theft from the education budget. "The evidence I'm presenting tonight," shows that approximately $200,000 in state education funding has been diverted from Cedar Falls schools over the past 18 months, Sarah announced, watching the board members' faces for reactions. This money was supposed to pay for textbooks, school supplies, and teacher salaries. Instead, it's been channeled through consulting contracts to companies that exist only on paper. The room fell silent, except for the scratching of pencils as reporters from the Cedar Falls Herald took notes. Sarah had expected surprise, concern, maybe even anger directed at the perpetrators. What she hadn't expected was the cold fury she saw in Superintendent Crawford's eyes, or the way several board members avoided making eye contact with her entirely. Board Chairman Robert Ashford, whose family owned the largest ranch in the county, leaned forward in his chair. "Miss Mitchell, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof that these alleged irregularities represent deliberate theft rather than administrative oversight?" Sarah opened her folder and began distributing copies of her analysis. The pattern of diversion is too consistent and sophisticated to be accidental. The shell companies receiving consulting payments have no employees, no office addresses that correspond to actual buildings, and no verifiable services provided to the school district. She watched the board members examine her evidence, noting how some studied the documents carefully while others barely glanced at them. The division was telling. 3 board members appeared genuinely shocked by her revelations, but the other 4, including Chairman Ashford, seemed more concerned about the implications of exposure than the theft itself. Furthermore, Sarah continued, "I've traced some of these consulting payments to companies that share business addresses with contributors to certain political campaigns. This isn't just theft from our children's education. It's a funding mechanism for political activities using taxpayer money." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Several audience members gasped, and Sarah could see people in the back rows craning their necks to get a better look at the documents she was distributing. The political implications were staggering. If education funds were being diverted to support political campaigns, it represented a violation of multiple state and federal laws. Superintendent Crawford stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Chairman Ashford, I move that this meeting be recessed, pending a thorough review of these allegations. Miss Mitchell's accusations are inflammatory and potentially libelous. They deserve careful examination before we allow this discussion to continue." Sarah felt the momentum slipping away from her. "With respect, Superintendent Crawford, the evidence speaks for itself. Delaying discussion won't change the mathematical reality of missing funds." Mathematical reality. Crawford's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Miss Mitchell, you're a 4th-grade teacher, not a forensic accountant. Your interpretation of complex budget documents may be well-intentioned, but it's hardly authoritative." The dismissive tone stung, but Sarah held her ground. "I have a master's degree in mathematics and 12 years of experience reviewing educational budgets. I'm qualified to identify discrepancies between reported and actual expenditures." Chairman Ashford called for order as murmurs rose from the audience. "Miss Mitchell, the board appreciates your concern for fiscal responsibility. However, these allegations require proper investigation through appropriate channels. We'll refer your materials to our external auditing firm for professional review." Sarah realized she was being managed rather than heard. The board had no intention of conducting a transparent investigation. They were buying time to develop a response strategy that would protect the people responsible for the theft while discrediting her as a troublemaker. "When can the community expect results from this audit?" Sarah pressed, sensing this might be her last opportunity to extract a public commitment. "These investigations take time, Miss Mitchell. We'll provide updates as appropriate." The non-answer confirmed Sarah's suspicions. There would be no real investigation, no accountability, no recovery of stolen funds. The corruption was too deeply embedded in the power structure for easy resolution. But she had underestimated how far the perpetrators would go to protect their scheme. The first indication of retaliation came 3 days later. Sarah arrived at school to find a formal letter in her mailbox from Superintendent Crawford, informing her that her teaching contract was being terminated immediately due to budget constraints and restructuring requirements. The timing was clearly retaliatory, but the documentation was carefully worded to provide legal cover. Sarah's colleagues were sympathetic but powerless. The teachers' union representative explained that budget-related terminations were difficult to challenge, especially for newer faculty without tenure protection. Sarah had been teaching for 12 years, but a gap in her employment early in her career meant she was still classified as non-tenured. Within a week, Sarah discovered that her termination was just the beginning. Her landlord, who had never mentioned any problems with her tenancy, suddenly served her with an eviction notice citing lease violations that didn't exist. When she tried to find alternative housing, every rental application was mysteriously rejected, despite her clean credit history and references. The coordinated nature of the retaliation became obvious when Sarah tried to find temporary employment. Businesses throughout Cedar Falls, many owned by families connected to the school board or political establishment, suddenly had no positions available for someone with her qualifications. The message was clear. Challenging the established order carried consequences that extended far beyond professional repercussions. Sarah's savings, carefully accumulated over years of modest living, disappeared quickly as she paid for temporary lodging and searched desperately for work. Within 2 weeks, she was sleeping in her car. Within 3 weeks, she couldn't afford gas to keep the car running and had been forced to abandon it when she couldn't make payments. The stables behind Murphy's feed store became her refuge not by choice, but by elimination. Every other shelter option had been systematically closed off through what could only be described as a coordinated campaign of economic warfare. The powerful families who controlled Cedar Falls had decided Sarah Mitchell represented a threat to their comfortable arrangement, and they intended to destroy her completely. Now, sitting in the darkness with only a thin blanket between her and the Montana winter, Sarah faced a terrible choice. She could leave town, abandoning her evidence and her fight for justice, but starting over somewhere else, with nothing. Or she could stay and continue pushing for accountability, knowing that each day increased the risk that she wouldn't survive the winter. The wind picked up again, finding every gap in the stable walls and reminding Sarah that her situation was becoming desperate. She had perhaps a week's worth of the canned goods she'd managed to salvage from dumpsters. Her boots were falling apart, her coat provided minimal protection against the cold, and her physical strength was diminishing from malnutrition and exposure. But even as her body weakened, Sarah's resolve hardened. The evidence of corruption was still hidden in her belongings, carefully preserved despite her circumstances. $200,000 stolen from children's education represented more than financial theft. It was a betrayal of trust, a corruption of democracy, and a crime against every family in Cedar Falls who believed their tax money was being used honestly. Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to conserve body heat as she planned her next move. The authorities in Cedar Falls were clearly compromised, but Montana was a big state with honest officials who might listen to evidence of corruption. The challenge was surviving long enough to reach them and presenting her case in a way that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Outside the stable, snow began falling again, each flake a reminder that time was running out. Sarah Mitchell closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges in her fight to expose the truth. She had no way of knowing that help was coming from an unexpected source, or that her desperate situation would soon intersect with forces that would turn her personal tragedy into the catalyst for statewide political upheaval. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of horses' hooves cutting through fresh snow woke Sarah from her restless sleep just after dawn. Through the gaps in the stable walls, she could see two riders approaching Murphy's feed store, their breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart racing as she recognized the uniform of the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department on one of the riders. Sheriff Marcus Thompson dismounted heavily, his boots crunching in the snow as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the feed store. The second rider was younger, maybe in his 20s, wearing a heavy ranch coat and sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Sarah couldn't make out their conversation, but she caught enough words to understand they were discussing her. Been reports of a vagrant living in these old stables, Sheriff Thompson was saying, his voice carrying across the crisp morning air. Property owner wants them cleared out before they cause trouble. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd been careful to leave no obvious traces of her presence, but apparently someone had noticed her coming and going from the abandoned building. The prospect of arrest terrified her not because of legal consequences, but because it would mean losing the evidence she'd hidden among her few possessions. The younger rider swung down from his horse, and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He was tall, with dark hair visible beneath his worn cowboy hat, and there was something in his posture that suggested strength without arrogance. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that contrasted with the sheriff's bluster. "Sheriff Thompson, those stables haven't been used for livestock in over 5 years. If someone's taking shelter there during this weather, maybe we should be asking why they don't have anywhere else to go." "Laws are laws, Daniel," the sheriff replied curtly. "Vagrancy is still a crime, and trespassing is trespassing. Property owners have rights, Daniel." Sarah filed the name away as she watched him study the stable building with thoughtful eyes. There was something about his manner that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the sheriff's approach to the situation. "My understanding is that Murphy hasn't used these buildings since his horses died," Daniel continued. "He's mentioned several times at the Cattlemen's Association meetings that he'd like to tear them down but can't afford the demolition costs." Sheriff Thompson's irritation was obvious in his body language. "That's not the point. The point is maintaining order and keeping undesirables from establishing camps that attract more of their kind." Sarah felt a surge of anger at being described as an undesirable, but she forced herself to remain hidden. Getting arrested wouldn't help her cause, and it certainly wouldn't help expose the corruption she'd uncovered. She needed to find another way to approach the authorities with her evidence. "Tell you what, Sheriff," Daniel said, pulling off his gloves and tucking them into his coat pocket. "Why don't you let me check out the situation first? If there's someone in there, I'd like to talk to them before we involve law enforcement. This isn't a social work project, son. We're here to clear out trespassers, and we will, if that's what the situation requires. But I'd like to understand what we're dealing with first." Sarah could hear the steel beneath Daniel's polite tone, and apparently so could Sheriff Thompson. The older man's posture shifted, and his voice took on a more deferential quality. "Of course, Mr. Ashford. I didn't mean to overstep. You handle it however you think best, Ashford." Sarah's heart sank as she realized Daniel's identity. He was part of the family that controlled Cedar Falls' political establishment, son of the school board chairman who had helped orchestrate her professional destruction. This wasn't a potential ally. This was the enemy's heir apparent. But as Daniel approached the stable entrance, something in his manner suggested Sarah's assumptions might be wrong. He moved carefully, almost respectfully, as if he understood that he might be intruding on someone's private space. When he called out, his voice was gentle rather than commanding. "Hello? Is someone in there? I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to talk." Sarah remained frozen in her hiding spot, torn between the instinct to flee and the recognition that she had nowhere to run. Her weakened condition meant she couldn't outrun a healthy man on horseback, and the Montana winter limited her options for concealment. "I know this situation must be frightening," Daniel continued, stepping just inside the stable entrance but not advancing further. "But I'm not here with the sheriff to arrest anyone. I'm here because I'm concerned about someone trying to survive outside in this weather." The sincerity in his voice was unexpected. Sarah had prepared herself for confrontation, arrest, or hostility. She hadn't prepared for what sounded like genuine human concern from someone whose family had systematically destroyed her life. "My name is Daniel Ashford. I own the AAA ranch about 10 miles north of here. If you're in these stables because you don't have anywhere else to go, maybe we can figure out a better solution." Sarah weighed her options quickly, continuing. To hide would only delay the inevitable confrontation, and Daniel's tone suggested he might be willing to listen to reason. More importantly, his offer of alternative arrangements might represent her only chance to survive the winter while continuing her fight for justice. Against her better judgment, Sarah emerged from her hiding spot among the empty horse stalls. Daniel's reaction to her appearance was immediate and visceral. She saw shock, then anger flash across his features as he took in her obvious malnutrition and inadequate clothing. "Jesus," he whispered, then caught himself. "I'm sorry. I wasn't expecting. How long have you been living like this?" 3 weeks, Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "Since I lost my job and my apartment." Daniel studied her face with obvious concern. "You're not from around here originally, are you? Your accent sounds like you might be from back east. Pennsylvania, originally, but I've been teaching in Cedar Falls for 12 years. Sarah watched his expression carefully, wondering if he would recognize her name or connect her to the school board controversy. "Teaching? You're an educator?" Daniel's surprise was genuine. "What subject?" "4th grade, all subjects. Or I was until 3 weeks ago." Sarah could see Daniel processing this information, trying to reconcile her professional background with her current circumstances. The cognitive dissonance was obvious in his expression. "What happened? How does a teacher with 12 years of experience end up homeless in Montana in December?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah realized this was her moment of truth. She could give Daniel a sanitized version of events that avoided mentioning his family's involvement in her destruction, or she could tell him the complete truth and risk confirming his worst assumptions about her character. "I discovered evidence of financial corruption in the school district," Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly. "When I presented it to the school board, I was fired in retaliation. Then I was evicted from my apartment, blacklisted from employment, throughout the area, and systematically destroyed by people who didn't want their crimes exposed." Daniel's expression shifted as the implications registered. "Financial corruption? What kind of corruption?" "Approximately $200,000 in state education funding has been diverted over the past 18 months through fake consulting contracts. The money was supposed to pay for textbooks, supplies, and teacher salaries. Instead, it's been channeled to shell companies that don't provide any actual services." "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Sarah gestured toward the small bundle of possessions she'd been using as a pillow. "I have copies of budget documents, bank records, incorporation papers for the shell companies, and analysis showing the pattern of diversion. Everything is documented and cross-referenced." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as if trying to determine whether she was delusional or telling the truth. Finally he spoke. "The school board meeting where you presented this evidence, was my father in attendance?" Sarah's heart raced as she realized Daniel understood exactly what she was telling him. "Chairman Ashford was present, yes. He's the one who moved to have my evidence referred to an external audit that never materialized. And after that meeting you were fired and evicted? Within a week. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental." Daniel turned away from her, walking to the stable entrance and looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Sheriff Thompson was still waiting beside the horses, probably growing impatient with the delay. Miss Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to tell me the truth. Do you believe my father is involved in this corruption? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Sarah realized that her answer would determine not just her immediate fate, but possibly her survival. If Daniel was loyal to his family above all else, admitting she suspected his father of criminal activity could seal her doom. But if Daniel was truly concerned about justice, lying to him now would undermine any chance of building trust and securing his help. The evidence suggests that several school board members, including your father, were aware of the financial irregularities and took steps to prevent investigation rather than addressing them. Whether that makes them willing participants or unwilling enablers, I can't say definitively. Daniel nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed suspicions he'd already harbored. My father has been acting strangely lately. More secretive, more defensive about school district business. I thought it was just the stress of budget cuts, but maybe there's more to it. There's definitely more to it. The question is whether anyone with the power to do something about it will care enough to act. Daniel turned back to face her, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Family. Loyalty warred with moral obligation. Comfortable ignorance battled uncomfortable truths. Sheriff Thompson is expecting me to either clear you out or have you arrested, Daniel said finally. But I don't think either of those options serves justice. What do you propose instead? Daniel looked directly into her eyes, and Sarah saw decision crystallize in his expression. Come home with me instead. The offer was so unexpected that Sarah thought she'd misheard him. What? Come home with me, to my ranch. You can't survive another week in these conditions, and if you're telling the truth about this corruption, the community needs to know about it. But first, you need to get healthy and strong enough to fight this battle effectively. Sarah stared at him, trying to process the implications of his offer. You're offering to shelter someone who's accused your father of criminal activity? I'm offering to help someone who might be the only person willing to expose criminal activity that's harming our community's children. If my father is involved in something illegal, I need to know about it. If he's innocent, the truth will vindicate him. The logic was sound, but Sarah couldn't shake her suspicion that this might be a trap designed to get her evidence into the hands of the people who wanted to destroy it. On the other hand, her current situation offered no realistic path to survival, let alone justice. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You have no reason to trust me. Daniel considered the question seriously. Because 12 years ago, when I was 16, a teacher at Cedar Falls Elementary took time after school to help me with mathematics when I was struggling. She didn't have to do that. She wasn't paid extra for it. But she cared enough about her students to give them whatever help they needed to succeed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as memory flooded back. A tall, lanky teenager with earnest eyes and determination to understand algebraic concepts that seemed to elude him. Hours spent after school working through problems, building confidence along with competence. Danny, she whispered, using the name he'd gone by in those days. You remember? I remember a boy who wouldn't quit trying, even when the math seemed impossible. I remember someone who always thanked me for my time and asked if there was anything he could do to help around the classroom. Daniel smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen since her ordeal began. I remember a teacher who treated a struggling student like he had potential worth developing. You changed my life, Miss Mitchell. Now maybe I can return the favor. The offer was real, and it represented her best chance for survival and justice. But accepting it would mean placing herself entirely at the mercy of someone whose family had orchestrated her destruction. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. Outside, Sheriff Thompson called out impatiently, "Daniel, we need to wrap this up. I've got other calls to handle today." "What's it going to be, Miss Mitchell?" Daniel asked quietly. "Are you willing to trust me?" Sarah looked around the decrepit stable that had been her home for 3 weeks, then at the evidence of corruption that represented her only weapon against powerful enemies. Finally, she looked at Daniel Ashford, the son of her enemy, who was offering her a chance at redemption. "Yes," she said, "I'll come home with you." The ride to AAA Ranch took 45 minutes through snow-packed mountain roads that wound between towering pine forests and frozen meadows. Sarah sat behind Daniel on his horse, grateful for the warmth of the animal's body heat and the windbreak provided by Daniel's broad shoulders. Sheriff Thompson had departed with a curt nod after Daniel explained that he was handling the situation personally. As they rode, Sarah found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The Montana wilderness that had seemed so hostile and unforgiving during her weeks of homelessness now revealed a stark beauty that took her breath away. Snow-covered peaks jutted against the crystal-clear sky like ancient monuments, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves cutting through fresh powder. "It's beautiful country," Sarah said, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the wind. "Most people think so," Daniel replied without turning around. "My grandfather used to say that Montana either claims you or rejects you. There's no middle ground." What did he mean by that? "Some folks come here looking for opportunity and find themselves fighting the land every day until they give up and leave. Others find that the challenges make them stronger and they can't imagine living anywhere else." Sarah considered this philosophy as they crested a ridge and the AAA ranch came into view below them. The main house was a sprawling log structure that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and golden light spilling from frost-covered windows. Surrounding buildings included a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved restlessly in the cold morning air. But what struck Sarah most was the sense of permanence and prosperity that radiated from the property. This wasn't just a working ranch. It was a legacy built over generations of hard work and careful stewardship. The contrast with her current circumstances was both humbling and intimidating. "How long has your family owned this land?" Sarah asked as they began the descent toward the ranch buildings. "My great-grandfather homesteaded here in 1889. 4 generations of Ashfords have worked this soil, raised cattle, and survived everything Montana could throw at them." The pride in Daniel's voice was unmistakable. But Sarah also detected something else: the weight of responsibility that comes with inheriting something built by previous generations' sacrifice. As they approached the main house, Sarah became acutely aware of her appearance. 3 weeks of homelessness had left her gaunt, dirty, and dressed in clothes that were falling apart. The prospect of meeting Daniel's family while looking like a vagrant filled her with mortification. "Daniel, maybe this isn't such a good idea," Sarah said as he helped her dismount. "I'm not exactly presentable for meeting your family." "My family will judge you by your character, not your circumstances," Daniel replied firmly. "Besides, my mother has a particular gift for making people feel welcome, regardless of how they arrive." Before Sarah could voice additional protests, the front door of the ranch house opened and a woman stepped onto the covered porch. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of sturdy build that suggested a lifetime of physical work. Her clothing was simple but well-made: wool pants, a flannel shirt, and a heavy cardigan that looked hand-knitted. "Danny?" the woman called out, using the family nickname that transported Sarah back to her days teaching the struggling teenager. "Who do you have with you?" "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Margaret Ashford's eyes took in Sarah's condition with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating injured animals or sick livestock. But instead of the judgment or suspicion Sarah expected, she saw only concern and immediate action. "Good heavens!" "Child, you're half frozen," Margaret said. hurrying down the porch steps despite the icy conditions. "Come inside immediately. We need to get you warm and fed before you catch pneumonia." "Mrs. Ashford, I don't want to impose," Sarah began, but Margaret cut her off with a gentle but firm hand on her arm. "Nonsense. Montana hospitality doesn't ask questions before offering shelter. We can sort out the details once you're warm and comfortable." As they entered the ranch house, Sarah was immediately enveloped by warmth that seemed to penetrate her bones after weeks of constant cold. The interior was everything she'd hoped for during her freezing nights in the stables. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of the heat, and the lingering aromas of coffee and fresh-baked bread. "Robert," Margaret called toward the back of the house. "Come meet our guest." Heavy footsteps approached, and Sarah found herself face to face with a man who could only be Daniel's father. Robert Ashford was tall and broad-shouldered like his son, but his hair was completely silver, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes held the same evaluating intelligence Sarah had noticed in Daniel. "Mom," Robert said with old-fashioned courtesy, "welcome to AAA Ranch. Any friend of Daniel's is welcome here." Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions as she looked at this man who embodied everything she'd expected from Montana ranchers. Strength, dignity, and traditional values. It was difficult to reconcile his apparent decency with her suspicions about his brother's involvement in the school district corruption. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford. Your hospitality is very generous." "Robert, this is Sarah Mitchell," Daniel said, and Sarah caught the slight emphasis he placed on her last name. "She's been having some difficulties lately." Robert's expression shifted subtly, and Sarah realized that Daniel was testing his father's reaction to her name. If Robert Ashford was involved in the conspiracy against her, hearing her identity might provoke some telltale response. But Robert's expression remained neutral and welcoming. "Mitchell! That name sounds familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so," Sarah replied carefully. "I've been teaching at Cedar Falls Elementary for the past 12 years, so you might have heard my name in connection with the school." "That's it," Robert said with apparent satisfaction. "My brother mentioned something about a teacher causing some fuss at a school board meeting recently. Nothing serious, I hope?" Sarah felt Daniel tense beside her. This was the moment of truth, when Robert Ashford would reveal whether he was an innocent bystander or an active participant in his brother's schemes. "There were some concerns about budget irregularities," Sarah said carefully. "I brought them to the board's attention. Budget problems seem to be everywhere these days," Robert replied with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I'm sure the board appreciated your diligence in identifying issues that needed attention. The response was either brilliantly deceptive or genuinely naive." Sarah couldn't determine which, but Daniel's slight relaxation suggested he was interpreting his father's reaction as evidence of innocence. "Now then," Margaret interrupted, clearly more interested in immediate practical concerns than political discussions. "Sarah, you look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks. When did you last eat?" The question reminded Sarah of her desperate hunger, a sensation she'd been trying to ignore during the stress of her encounter with Daniel and the sheriff. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before. Time gets a bit blurry when you're focused on staying warm." Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "Robert, help Sarah get settled in the guest room. Daniel, come with me to the kitchen. We're going to prepare a meal that will put some meat back on this young woman's bones." As Margaret and Daniel headed toward the kitchen, Robert gestured for Sarah to follow him up a staircase lined with family photographs spanning several generations. The guest room he showed her was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in handmade quilts, a washstand with fresh towels, and a window that looked out over the snow-covered pastures. "The washroom is right across the hall," Robert said. "Take all the time you need to get cleaned up. Margaret will probably have food ready in about an hour, but don't feel pressured to come down before you're ready." Sarah looked at the bed with longing she hadn't felt since losing her apartment. "Mr. Ashford, I need you to understand that I can't pay you for this hospitality. I don't have any money, and I don't know when I'll be able to get back on my feet financially." Robert's expression grew serious. "Miss Mitchell, let me tell you something about ranch hospitality. When someone shows up at your door in need, you help them, period. You don't ask about payment, you don't demand explanations, and you don't set time limits on basic human decency. But I could be here for weeks, maybe longer. Then you'll be here for weeks or longer. This ranch has survived 4 generations because we understand that helping others isn't a business transaction. It's an obligation that comes with being human." The simple dignity of Robert's statement brought tears to Sarah's eyes. After weeks of being treated as a pariah by the Cedar Falls establishment, encountering genuine kindness felt almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I don't know how to repay this generosity. Get healthy, get strong, and figure out how to solve whatever problems brought you to our door. That's payment enough for any decent person." After Robert left, Sarah stood alone in the guest room, trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. 12 hours ago, she'd been preparing for what might have been her final night alive in an abandoned stable. Now she was standing in a warm, comfortable room with the promise of a hot meal and genuine human kindness. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, and Sarah found herself wondering if this was some elaborate trap designed to lull her into complacency before destroying her completely. But the alternative was returning to the stables and certain death from exposure. So she decided to trust Daniel's good faith at least long enough to regain her strength. The hot bath Sarah took was the first she'd enjoyed in 3 weeks, and the sensation of being truly clean again felt like a form of resurrection. When she examined herself in the mirror afterward, she was shocked by the changes homelessness had wrought. Her face was gaunt, her hair had lost its shine, and her eyes held a haunted quality that hadn't been there a month ago. But underneath the damage, she could still see traces of the confident educator she'd been before her world collapsed. The question was whether that person could be restored, and whether she'd have the strength to continue fighting for justice once she was healthy again. When Sarah finally made her way downstairs, she found the Ashford family gathered around a large dining table laden with food that looked like a feast after her weeks of scavenging. Margaret had prepared roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie that filled the room with the scent of cinnamon and butter. "Perfect timing," Margaret said, rising to pull out a chair for Sarah. Everything just finished cooking. As they sat down to eat, Sarah found herself studying the family dynamics with the analytical eye of an educator. Daniel and his father maintained easy conversation about ranch business, while Margaret orchestrated the meal with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding working men with large appetites. But Sarah also noticed subtle tensions beneath the surface harmony. Daniel watched his father carefully when certain topics arose, and Robert seemed to be choosing his words more carefully than necessary for casual family conversation. "Sarah," Margaret said during a lull in the ranch talk, "Daniel mentioned that you're a teacher. What grade do you work with?" "4th grade, all subjects." "Or I did, until recently." Sarah decided to address her situation directly rather than trying to hide it. "I was terminated from my position 3 weeks ago. Budget cuts," Robert asked with apparent sympathy. "I know the school district has been struggling with funding issues." "Something like that," Sarah replied noncommittally, not wanting to launch into accusations during her first meal with the family. Daniel, however, seemed determined to bring the issue into the open. "Dad, Sarah discovered some irregularities in the school budget. When she reported them to Uncle Marcus and the school board, she was fired in retaliation." Robert set down his fork and looked directly at Sarah. "Marcus is my younger brother and chairman of the school board. Are you suggesting he was involved in some kind of wrongdoing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized this was her opportunity to gauge Robert's true position on his brother's activities and the corruption she'd uncovered. I'm suggesting that the evidence I presented showed systematic diversion of education funds, and that the board's response was to silence the messenger rather than investigate the message, Sarah said carefully. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Finally he spoke. Miss Mitchell, I need to tell you something about my brother Marcus. He's always been ambitious, always looking for ways to increase his influence and wealth. Sometimes his judgment has been questionable. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Robert's admission suggested he might be an ally rather than an enemy, someone who could help expose the corruption rather than cover it up. What kind of questionable judgment? The kind that prioritizes political connections over community welfare. The kind that treats public office as an opportunity for personal advancement rather than public service. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Dad, are you saying you think Uncle Marcus might be involved in the kind of corruption Sarah discovered? Robert looked around the table at his family, then back at Sarah. I'm saying that if someone presented credible evidence of financial wrongdoing to my brother, and his response was to destroy that person rather than investigate their claims, then we have a serious problem that goes beyond education policy. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. Robert Ashford seemed to be positioning himself as a potential ally, but she needed to be certain of his motivations before trusting him with her evidence. Mr. Ashford, if I could prove that education funds were being systematically stolen, and that school board members, including your brother, were involved, would you be willing to help expose the truth? Miss Mitchell, Robert said with quiet intensity, if my brother is stealing money meant for children's education, I'll personally drag him to the county sheriff and demand his arrest. Family loyalty doesn't extend to protecting criminals. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Sarah felt immediate panic, wondering if Sheriff Thompson had returned with a warrant, or if other agents of the Cedar Falls establishment had tracked her to the ranch. Daniel rose from the table and headed toward the door. I'll get it. Through the dining room window, Sarah could see the silhouette of a lone rider on horseback, someone who'd braved the winter weather to reach the ranch after dark. When Daniel opened the door, cold air swept into the house, along with a voice Sarah recognized with growing dread. Evening, Daniel. I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Mitchell. I have reason to believe she might be here. The voice belonged to Marcus Ashford, school board chairman and Robert's younger brother. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the man who had orchestrated the cover-up of her evidence and set in motion the systematic destruction of her life. Through the dining room doorway, she could see his silhouette framed in the entrance. Snow dusting his expensive coat and his breath forming clouds in the frigid evening air. Uncle Marcus, Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. This is unexpected. What brings you out in this weather? As I said, I'm looking for Sarah Mitchell. We have reason to believe she's been spreading malicious rumors about the school district, and there are concerns about her mental stability. Sarah felt Margaret's hand find hers under the table, a gesture of support that steadied her racing heart. Robert's expression had hardened into something resembling granite, and she could sense the family closing ranks around her, even though they'd known her for less than 4 hours. Mental stability. Daniel's voice carried a dangerous edge. That's quite an accusation, Uncle Marcus. What evidence do you have to support such a serious claim? Marcus stepped fully into the house, uninvited, his eyes scanning the interior as if searching for signs of Sarah's presence. The woman made wild accusations against respected community members at a public meeting. When those accusations were properly investigated and found to be baseless, she became increasingly erratic and paranoid. Properly investigated? Robert's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Marcus, what investigation are you referring to? Because I haven't heard anything about external audits or forensic accounting reviews. Sarah watched the brothers face each other across the entryway, and the family resemblance was obvious despite their different builds and coloring. But where Robert projected solid integrity, Marcus emanated the kind of practiced charm that Sarah had learned to associate with politicians and used car salesmen. The investigation is ongoing, Robert. These matters require discretion to protect the reputations of innocent parties who might be caught up in unfounded allegations. Innocent parties like yourself? Robert's question was pointed enough to make Marcus visibly uncomfortable. Among others, yes. The fact is, this woman has made serious accusations against multiple community leaders without providing credible evidence to support her claims. Sarah felt compelled to defend herself. Despite the obvious danger of revealing her presence, she rose from her chair and walked to the dining room doorway where Marcus could see her clearly. "Mr. Ashford," she said, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster, "I have extensive documentation supporting every claim I made at that school board meeting. The evidence includes budget records, bank statements, incorporation documents for shell companies, and detailed analysis showing systematic diversion of education funds." Marcus's reaction to seeing her was immediate and telling. His practiced smile faltered, and Sarah saw genuine alarm flash across his features before he regained control. "Miss Mitchell, I'm surprised to find you here imposing on my brother's hospitality. Given your recent difficulties, perhaps it would be better if you sought professional help rather than involving innocent families in your problems." The condescending tone ignited Sarah's anger. But before she could respond, Robert stepped between his brother and the dining room. "Marcus, Miss Mitchell is a guest in my home, and she'll be treated with the respect due any guest. If you have business with her, you can conduct it civilly or not at all. Robert, you don't understand the situation. This woman has been living like a vagrant, making wild accusations against prominent citizens. She needs help, not encouragement." "I understand the situation perfectly," Robert replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. "A teacher discovered financial irregularities and reported them through proper channels. Instead of investigating her concerns, the school board destroyed her professionally and personally. Now you're here trying to intimidate her into silence." Marcus's expression shifted as he realized that Robert wasn't going to be easily manipulated. "That's not what happened, Robert. The woman made unsubstantiated allegations that could have damaged the careers of good people. The board acted appropriately to protect the community from false accusations." "Then let's examine the evidence," Sarah said, walking back to the dining room table where her bundle of possessions lay beside her chair. "I have everything documented and cross-referenced. If my allegations are false, the evidence will prove it." She began unpacking her carefully preserved documents, spreading them across the dining room table like a prosecutor laying out exhibits for a jury. Budget reports, bank statements, incorporation papers, and her detailed analysis filled the available space in organized stacks that represented months of careful research. Marcus moved closer to the table, ostensibly to examine the documents, but actually positioning himself where he could potentially destroy them if the opportunity arose. Sarah noticed his strategic positioning and made sure to stay between him and her evidence. "These are internal school district documents," Marcus said, his voice taking on an accusatory tone. "How did you obtain confidential financial records?" "These documents were distributed to all faculty members during budget meetings," Sarah replied evenly. "They're not confidential. They're supposed to be transparent public records that show how taxpayer money is being spent." Daniel moved to the table and began examining the documents with obvious interest. His background in ranch management had given him experience with financial analysis, and Sarah could see comprehension dawning in his expression as he studied her work. "These shell companies," Daniel said, pointing to a stack of incorporation papers. "They all list the same registered agent, and their business addresses don't correspond to actual buildings." "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "The consulting contracts show payments totaling nearly $200,000 over 18 months to companies that have no employees. No office space, and no identifiable services provided to the school district. Margaret joined the examination, her practical intelligence immediately grasping the implications of what Sarah had uncovered. Where did this money go if the companies didn't actually provide services? That's what needs to be investigated by proper authorities, Sarah said. The paper trail leads to shell companies, but tracking the money beyond that point requires subpoena powers and forensic accounting expertise. Robert studied one of the consulting contracts with the focused attention of someone who understood business agreements. This contract is for educational assessment services, but there's no specification of deliverables, no timeline for completion, and no evaluation criteria for performance. Exactly, Sarah said. It's a fake contract designed to move money from the education budget to unknown recipients without providing any actual services. Marcus had remained silent during this examination, but Sarah could see growing desperation in his posture as the family absorbed the implications of her evidence. Finally, he spoke with barely controlled anger. "This is highly irregular, Robert. You're allowing a disturbed individual to make wild accusations based on documents she may have altered or fabricated." "The documents can be verified through official channels," Sarah replied calmly. "Original copies exist in school district files and state education department records. Anyone can request them through Freedom of Information Act procedures. Then why haven't you done that, instead of making public accusations based on possibly altered documents?" Sarah felt her composure crack slightly. "Because the moment I raised these concerns publicly, I was fired, evicted, and systematically destroyed by people who wanted to silence me before I could pursue official channels." "You were terminated due to budget constraints, not retaliation," Marcus insisted, but his defensive tone suggested he understood how weak the claim sounded. "I was terminated within 3 days of presenting evidence of corruption to the school board. My eviction notice was served the same week. Every employment opportunity in Cedar Falls suddenly disappeared, despite my clean record and excellent references. The timing and coordination were too precise to be coincidental." Daniel looked up from the documents with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. "Uncle Marcus, these financial irregularities are pretty obvious once you understand what to look for. If the school board received this evidence a month ago, why hasn't there been any public announcement about investigation results? These matters take time, Daniel. Proper investigation requires careful review by qualified professionals." "What qualified professionals?" Robert interjected. "I haven't heard anything about external auditors being engaged, and I serve on the County Budget Oversight Committee. Financial investigations of this magnitude would have come to our attention." Marcus was clearly losing control of the conversation, and Sarah could see him calculating his options. He'd come to the ranch expecting to intimidate or discredit her, but instead found himself facing a united family that was taking her evidence seriously. "Robert, I think you're allowing your natural hospitality to cloud your judgment," Marcus said, switching to a more conciliatory tone. "This woman may believe her own accusations, but that doesn't make them true. Mental illness often manifests as elaborate conspiracy theories that seem logical to the person experiencing them." The suggestion that she was mentally ill hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Margaret stepped forward with maternal fury that was intimidating to witness. "Marcus Ashford, how dare you come into my home and suggest that a guest is mentally ill because she discovered evidence of wrongdoing? This young woman has presented clear documentation of financial irregularities, and instead of addressing her concerns, you're attacking her character. Margaret, I understand your desire to help someone you perceive as vulnerable, but nothing," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing ranch operations and raising strong children. "Sarah has shown us evidence that would concern any reasonable person. If you're so confident her accusations are false, Why don't you welcome a transparent investigation that would clear your name? Marcus's composure finally cracked. Because I don't have to submit to investigations based on the paranoid fantasies of a homeless vagrant who's trying to blame her personal failures on successful community members. The cruel characterization hung in the air like a slap, and Sarah felt the shame of her circumstances wash over her despite understanding that her situation had been deliberately engineered by Marcus and his associates, but instead of the agreement or sympathy Marcus might have expected, his attack provoked visible anger from every member of the Ashford family. Robert's expression turned dangerous, Daniel's hands clenched into fists, and Margaret's eyes blazed with protective fury. "Get out," Robert said quietly, but with unmistakable finality. "Get off my property and don't come back. Robert, you're making a mistake. This woman will bring nothing but trouble to your family." "The only trouble I see is a man who responds to evidence of corruption with personal attacks and intimidation," Robert replied. "Sarah Mitchell is welcome in my home as long as she wants to stay." "You are not." Marcus looked around the room, perhaps expecting some member of his family to support his position, but found only unified opposition to his presence. His political instincts seemed to recognize that he'd overplayed his hand and alienated potential allies. "This isn't over," he said, directing the threat at Sarah rather than his brother. "There are legal remedies for dealing with people who make false accusations against public officials, and there are legal remedies for dealing with public officials who steal from children's education," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I look forward to seeing which legal remedy proves more effective." After Marcus left, the family stood in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, processing the confrontation and its implications. Sarah felt simultaneously grateful for their support and guilty about bringing conflict into their home. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't want to cause problems between you and your brother." Robert shook his head firmly. "Marcus caused the problems when he chose corruption over integrity. You just exposed them. What happens now?" Daniel asked, still studying the evidence spread across the dining room table. "Now we figure out how to get this information to authorities who will investigate it properly," Robert said. "And we make sure Sarah is safe while that investigation proceeds." Margaret began clearing the interrupted dinner plates, but her attention remained focused on the conversation. "Sarah, do you have any idea how extensive this corruption might be? Are we talking about just the school district, or could it involve other government agencies?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "The evidence I've developed focuses on education funding, but the methods being used could easily be applied to other budget categories. If someone has figured out how to create fake companies and consulting contracts to steal from one government program, they might be using the same techniques elsewhere." The implications were staggering. What Sarah had initially discovered as education budget irregularities might represent just one facet of a much larger corruption network that extended throughout Cedar Falls government structure. "We're going to need help," Robert said, understanding the scope of what they were facing. "This is beyond what any individual family can handle alone." "What kind of help?" Sarah asked. "The kind that comes with badges and subpoena power," Robert replied grimly. "It's time to contact the State Attorney General's office." As the family discussed strategy for exposing the corruption network, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the night she presented her evidence to the school board: hope. The Ashford family had not only believed her accusations, but committed themselves to helping her fight for justice. But she also understood that their support would make them targets for the same kind of systematic retaliation she'd experienced. By choosing to help her, they declared war against powerful interests that had proven willing to destroy anyone who threatened their profitable schemes. The real test of character wasn't whether Sarah could survive her ordeal, but whether the Ashford family would maintain their support when the full weight of Cedar Falls' corrupt establishment turned against them. The morning after Marcus Ashford's confrontational visit, Sarah woke in the guest bedroom, feeling genuinely rested for the first time in weeks. Sunlight streamed through frost-covered windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the warm air rising from the heating vents. The contrast with her recent mornings in the freezing stables was so dramatic that for a moment she wondered if the entire experience had been a nightmare. But the sound of voices from the kitchen below reminded her that her situation, while improved, remained precarious. The Ashford family had committed to helping her expose the corruption in Cedar Falls, but translating that commitment into effective action would require careful planning and considerable courage from everyone involved. When Sarah made her way downstairs, she found the family gathered around the kitchen table with a man she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 40 years old, lean and weathered in the way of someone who spent significant time outdoors, but his clothes and bearing suggested professional rather than ranch work. "Sarah," Robert said, rising as she entered the kitchen, "I'd like you to meet Tom Bradley. He's an investigative reporter with the Helena Independent Record, and he drove down here this morning to hear your story." Sarah felt a mixture of hope and apprehension as she shook hands with the reporter. Media attention could help expose the corruption, but it could also make her an even bigger target for retaliation. "Miss Mitchell," Bradley said, his handshake firm and his eyes alert with professional interest. "Mr. Ashford contacted my editor late last night about potential corruption in Cedar Falls. We're very interested in what you've discovered." "Before we proceed," Sarah said, settling into the chair Margaret had prepared for her, "I need to understand how this will work. If I share my evidence with you, what protections do I have against further retaliation?" Bradley's expression grew serious. "Honestly, Miss Mitchell, I can't offer you complete protection. Investigative journalism sometimes puts sources at risk, and I won't lie to you about that reality. But I can promise you that your story will be told accurately and completely, and that public exposure often provides better protection than secrecy." Daniel poured coffee for Sarah and took a seat across from her. "Tom has been investigating government corruption throughout Montana for over 15 years. His work has led to multiple prosecutions and policy reforms." "What kind of prosecutions?" Sarah asked, encouraged by the possibility that her evidence might lead to actual legal consequences for the perpetrators. "County commissioners, city council members, school board officials," Bradley replied. "White-collar corruption is unfortunately common in small Montana communities, often because people assume no one is paying attention to local government finances." Margaret set a plate of eggs, bacon and toast in front of Sarah, then joined the conversation. "Tom, what would you need from Sarah to develop a story that could force official investigation?" "Primary source documents, verifiable financial records, and testimony from credible witnesses," Bradley said, consulting a notepad he'd placed beside his coffee cup. "From what Robert described last night, Miss Mitchell has most of what we'd need." Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. Cooperating with the reporter would mean going public with accusations that had already destroyed her life once. But it might also represent her best chance for achieving justice and recovering her stolen future. "Mr. Bradley, if I provide you with my evidence, how quickly could you publish a story?" "That depends on verification requirements and legal review," Bradley replied. "Financial investigations take time to fact-check properly. We're probably looking at 2 to 3 weeks for a comprehensive story." 2 to 3 weeks, Sarah repeated, considering the timeline. "That gives the corruption network significant time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and prepare counter-narratives." Robert leaned forward in his chair. "What if we approach this from multiple directions simultaneously? Media investigation, state attorney general notification, and federal authorities if necessary." The suggestions sparked animated discussion as the family and reporter began developing a coordinated strategy for exposing the corruption. Sarah found herself impressed by their systematic approach to what could have been an overwhelming challenge. The key is preventing them from containing the story locally, Bradley explained. If this just becomes a Cedar Falls political dispute, they can probably weather the storm and wait for attention to move elsewhere. But if it becomes a statewide story about systematic corruption, they'll face pressure that's harder to manage. Daniel had been quietly studying the evidence Sarah had organized on the dining room table. Tom, have you ever encountered shell company schemes like this in other communities? Unfortunately, yes. It's a common method for stealing public funds because it creates legitimate-looking paperwork that can fool cursory oversight. Bradley joined Daniel at the dining room table and began examining the documentation. But Miss Mitchell's analysis is more thorough than most. She's identified patterns that clearly demonstrate intent to defraud rather than administrative error. Sarah felt vindicated by the professional assessment. I spent 3 months documenting everything before I brought it to the school board. I wanted to be absolutely certain of my facts before making public accusations. That thoroughness is going to be crucial for building a compelling case, Bradley said. But I noticed something interesting about the timing of these transactions. They seem to cluster around budget approval periods and election cycles. Margaret looked up from the breakfast dishes she was washing. What does that suggest? It suggests the theft was timed to maximize political benefit, Sarah replied, understanding Bradley's observation. The money was diverted when it could be most useful for campaign activities and when budget oversight would be most relaxed. Robert's expression darkened as the implications registered. They weren't just stealing education funding. They were using stolen taxpayer money to finance political campaigns that would keep them in power to steal more. The enormity of the corruption was becoming clearer as they analyzed the evidence systematically. This wasn't simple financial theft. It was a scheme to subvert democratic processes, using public funds to perpetuate the criminals' control over local government. We need to understand the full scope of this operation before we go public, Bradley said. If similar schemes exist in other departments or agencies, exposing just the education component might allow the rest of the network to escape scrutiny. Daniel looked thoughtful. How would we investigate other potential fraud without alerting the subjects that we're onto them? Carefully, Robert replied. And with help from people who have access to information, we don't. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle in the ranch's driveway. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see a pickup truck with official government plates approaching the main house. That's Sheriff Kevin Morrison, Robert said, his voice tense with concern. He's Marcus's brother-in-law, and they've been political allies for years. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. If Sheriff Morrison was here to arrest her or confiscate her evidence, all their planning would become irrelevant. She began gathering the documents spread across the dining room table, preparing to hide them if necessary, but Robert placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Don't panic. Morrison may be related to Marcus, but he's not necessarily corrupt himself. Let's see what he wants before we assume the worst. Sheriff Morrison knocked on the front door with the measured authority of someone accustomed to being admitted immediately. When Robert opened the door, Sarah could see a middle-aged man with graying hair and the kind of solid build that suggested former military service. "Robert," Morrison said, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "I need to speak with you about a situation involving your house guest." "What kind of situation, Kevin?" "The kind that involves accusations of theft, harassment, and possible mental instability," Morrison replied, his eyes scanning the interior of the house. "I've received multiple complaints about Sarah Mitchell's conduct, and there are concerns about her influence on your family." Sarah stepped forward before Robert could respond. "Sheriff Morrison, I'm Sarah Mitchell. What specific complaints have you received and who filed them?" Morrison studied her appearance with professional assessment, taking in her improved condition compared to her weeks of homelessness. "Miss Mitchell, I've received reports that you've been making false accusations against respected community members, stealing confidential documents, and engaging in harassing behavior toward public officials. Those are serious charges, Tom Bradley interjected, identifying himself as a reporter and producing his press credentials. What evidence supports these accusations? Morrison's expression shifted slightly as he registered the presence of media. Mr. Bradley, this is an ongoing investigation. I can't discuss specific evidence or sources, but you can discuss the nature of the complaints. Bradley pressed, his reporter's instincts engaging with the story's potential. The complaints allege that Miss Mitchell obtained confidential school district documents through unauthorized means, presented altered or fabricated evidence at a public meeting, and has continued to harass school board members despite being asked to cease contact. Sarah felt anger rising at the systematic distortion of her actions. Sheriff, the documents I presented were distributed to all faculty members during official budget meetings. They're not confidential, and I certainly didn't steal them. As for harassment, I've had no contact with school board members since the night I presented my evidence. The complainants suggest otherwise, Morrison replied. They claim you've been spreading false rumors, attempting to contact board members at their homes, and engaging in stalking behavior. Robert stepped between Sarah and the sheriff, his protective instincts clearly engaged. And Kevin, these accusations sound like retaliation against someone who exposed uncomfortable truths. Have you actually investigated the evidence Sarah presented to the school board? Morrison's hesitation suggested he hadn't examined the corruption allegations in detail. Robert, my job is to investigate criminal complaints, not audit school district finances. That's outside my jurisdiction. But theft of public funds is within your jurisdiction, Bradley observed pointedly. If Miss Mitchell's evidence shows systematic diversion of taxpayer money, wouldn't that warrant criminal investigation? The question created obvious tension for Morrison, who found himself caught between family loyalty and professional obligation. Sarah could see him calculating the political implications of different responses. Any investigation of financial irregularities would need to be requested by the appropriate government agencies, Morrison said finally. The sheriff's department doesn't initiate audits based on complaints from private citizens. Margaret joined the conversation with maternal directness. Kevin Morrison, you've known this family for 20 years. Do you seriously believe Robert would harbor a criminal in his home, or that we'd support false accusations against innocent people? Morrison's expression softened slightly at Margaret's appeal to personal relationships. Mrs. Ashford, I don't question your family's integrity, but good people can sometimes be deceived by individuals with hidden agendas. Then examine the evidence yourself, Sarah said, gesturing toward the documents spread across the dining room table. If my allegations are false, the evidence will prove it. If they're true, you'll have a criminal investigation that needs immediate attention. Morrison approached the dining room table with obvious reluctance, but professional curiosity seemed to overcome his political caution. As he studied the financial documents, Sarah watched comprehension dawn in his expression. These consulting contracts, Morrison said slowly, they don't specify any deliverable services. That's correct, Sarah replied. $200,000 paid to companies that exist only on paper for services that were never provided. Morrison continued examining the evidence, his law enforcement training allowing him to recognize the patterns of fraud that Sarah had documented. This shell company address corresponds to a vacant lot downtown. There's no building at this location. None of the shell companies have legitimate business addresses, Daniel added, joining the examination. They're all registered to mail drops or non-existent locations. Bradley was taking detailed notes as Morrison absorbed the implications of Sarah's evidence. The sheriff's reaction would be crucial for determining whether local law enforcement could be trusted to investigate the corruption or whether higher authorities would be necessary. Miss Mitchell, Morrison said finally, this evidence suggests serious criminal activity. Why didn't you bring it directly to law enforcement instead of presenting it at a school board meeting? Because I believed the school board had the authority and responsibility to address financial irregularities in their own budget, Sarah replied. I expected them to welcome evidence that could help recover stolen funds and improve fiscal oversight. Instead, they destroyed her professionally and personally, Robert added grimly. Kevin, you know my brother Marcus. Do his actions since that school board meeting look like those of an innocent man? Morrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the evidence and considering the political implications of what he was seeing. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with an expression of grudging respect. Miss Mitchell, I owe you an apology. The evidence you've presented is compelling and warrants immediate criminal investigation. But I need you to understand that investigating corruption involving school board members and their associates will create significant political pressure on my department. What kind of pressure? Bradley asked, his reporter's instincts sensing a story angle. The kind that affects election funding, county budget allocations, and career advancement, Morrison replied with unusual candor. White-collar corruption cases are politically dangerous for local law enforcement. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the sheriff's honesty about the constraints he faced. Sheriff Morrison, what would you need to initiate a formal investigation that couldn't be shut down by political pressure? Morrison considered the question carefully. State-level support, federal oversight if necessary, and media attention that makes it impossible to sweep the investigation under the rug. We can provide all three, Robert said firmly. The question is whether you're willing to do your job despite the political consequences. Morrison looked around the room at faces that represented different aspects of the community. He'd sworn to protect the rancher who embodied traditional values, the teacher fighting for children's education, the reporter committed to exposing truth, and the family willing to risk their comfortable position to support justice. Miss Mitchell, Morrison said, I'm going to need you to make a formal complaint at my office this afternoon. Bring your evidence, and I'll initiate a criminal investigation into theft of public funds. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. Sheriff Morrison's support would provide legitimacy to her accusations and legal protection against further retaliation. But it would also make her the central figure in a criminal investigation that would certainly provoke desperate responses from the corruption network. Sheriff, she said, what protection can you provide for witnesses and complainants during the investigation? Limited protection, Morrison admitted honestly. But once formal charges are filed, intimidating witnesses becomes a separate felony that carries serious consequences. As they discussed the logistics of initiating the criminal investigation, Sarah realized that the alliance forming around her represented something unprecedented in Cedar Falls. A coalition of citizens willing to challenge the corrupt establishment despite personal risk, but she also understood that their commitment would be tested severely once the investigation became public and the full weight of the corruption network's resources turned against them. 3 days after, Sheriff Morrison opened his formal investigation. Sarah sat in the Cedar Falls courthouse, waiting to give her official statement, when Tom Bradley burst through the main entrance with the expression of a reporter who'd stumbled onto something explosive. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by barely contained excitement, mixed with what appeared to be genuine alarm. Sarah, Bradley called out, approaching her with quick, purposeful steps. We need to talk privately. What I've discovered changes everything about this case. Sarah followed the reporter to a small conference room the courthouse staff had made available for their meeting. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Morrison's patrol car pulling into the parking lot, followed by a sedan with state government plates that suggested their investigation had attracted attention from Helena. What did you find? Sarah asked, settling into one of the uncomfortable metal chairs that furnished the Spartan room. Bradley opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her, displaying what appeared to be a complex financial flowchart with dozens of interconnected boxes and arrows. Remember how you suspected the shell company scheme might extend beyond education funding? You were right, but the scope is much bigger than any of us imagined. Sarah studied the diagram, recognizing some of the company names from her own investigation, but seeing dozens of additional entities she'd never encountered. How much bigger are we talking about? Tried $2.3 million over the past 4 years, Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of the discovery. Education funding was just the beginning. They've been systematically looting county road maintenance budgets, emergency services funding, agricultural development grants, and federal infrastructure money. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had uncovered evidence of $200,000 in stolen education funds, but Bradley's investigation suggested that was less than 10% of the total theft. How many people are involved in this? That's where it gets really interesting, Bradley replied, clicking to a different screen that displayed a network diagram showing relationships between various individuals. At least 12 public officials, 6 business leaders, and what appears to be a coordinated network that extends into state-level politics. Sarah felt her understanding of the situation shift dramatically. What she'd initially discovered as local corruption had revealed itself as part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated across multiple jurisdictions and government levels. Who's coordinating this operation? Someone has to be managing the financial flows and political protection. Bradley's expression grew grim. That's the part that's going to shock you. The coordination is coming from Helena, State Senator Patricia. Wells has been using her position on appropriations committees to identify funding streams that can be diverted through shell company schemes in rural counties throughout Montana. Sarah recognized the name immediately. Senator Wells was a powerful political figure who had built her career on advocating for rural Montana interests and fiscal responsibility. The irony of her stealing from the community she claimed to champion was breathtaking. How did you uncover the state-level connections? Financial analysis, Bradley replied, pulling up bank records that showed fund transfers between various accounts. The shell companies you identified in Cedar Falls are connected to similar operations in 6 other counties. The money flows through a complex network of transfers, but ultimately significant portions end up in accounts controlled by entities connected to Wells' political organization. The door to the conference room opened, and Sheriff Morrison entered, followed by a woman Sarah didn't recognize. She was perhaps 50 years old, professionally dressed, and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to wielding significant power. "Miss Mitchell," Morrison said, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Attorney General Linda Chen from the Montana Department of Justice. She's here because your case has attracted state-level attention." Chen approached Sarah with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that suggested both competence and determination. "Miss Mitchell, I've reviewed the evidence you've provided to Sheriff Morrison, and I want you to know that your courage in exposing this corruption may have uncovered the largest public corruption case in Montana's recent history." Sarah felt simultaneously vindicated and overwhelmed by the scope of what she'd accidentally discovered. "Deputy Attorney General Chen, I was just trying to recover stolen education funding for children in Cedar Falls. I had no idea it was part of something this extensive. Criminal enterprises often start small and expand over time," Chen replied, taking a seat at the conference table. "Your education funding investigation provided the thread that's allowed us to unravel a much larger conspiracy." Bradley turned his laptop toward Chen and Morrison, displaying the financial network he'd mapped through his investigation. "I've identified shell company operations in Billings, Great Falls, Missoula, Kalispell, Bozeman, and Helena. The pattern is identical in each location. Fake consulting contracts, non-existent companies, and systematic diversion of public funds." Chen studied the diagram with obvious interest. "Mr. Bradley, how confident are you in this analysis? Accusations of corruption against a sitting state senator require extremely solid evidence. Confident enough to stake my professional reputation on it," Bradley replied. I've cross-referenced bank records, incorporation documents, campaign finance reports, and legislative voting patterns. The evidence shows systematic coordination between Senator Wells's political organization and the shell company networks in all 7 counties. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression reflecting the gravity of what they were discussing. Deputy Chen, what kind of resources will be needed to investigate corruption at this level? Significant resources, Chen replied. We're talking about a multi-agency task force involving the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and potentially federal prosecutors if the evidence supports RICO charges. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. The investigation that had started with her desperate attempt to expose local corruption had evolved into something that would involve federal law enforcement agencies and potentially destroy the careers of powerful political figures. What does this mean for Sarah's safety? Daniel asked from the doorway, where he'd apparently been listening to the conversation. If she's blown the cover on a statewide criminal enterprise, won't that make her a target for retaliation? Jen's expression grew serious. Mr. Ashford, that's a legitimate concern. Once this investigation becomes public, Miss Mitchell may face significant personal risk from people who have a lot to lose. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. By pursuing justice for stolen education funds, she'd inadvertently declared war on a criminal network with millions of dollars at stake and political connections that reached the highest levels of state government. What kind of protection can you provide? Margaret asked, joining the growing crowd in the small conference room. Limited protection initially, Chen admitted. But once federal agencies become involved, witness protection resources become available if the threat level justifies them. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's radio crackling with an urgent message from his dispatcher. Sheriff Morrison, we have reports of a break-in at the AAA ranch. No injuries reported, but significant property damage. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. The corruption network was already moving to retaliate against the Ashford family for supporting her investigation. We need to get back to the ranch immediately. The drive to AAA Ranch was tense and largely silent, with Morrison leading a convoy that included Chen's state vehicle and Bradley's truck. Sarah rode with Daniel, both of them dreading what they might find when they arrived at the property that had become her sanctuary. The damage was immediately apparent as they approached the main house. Windows had been shattered, the front door hung askew on its hinges, and furniture had been thrown onto the front porch. But the real message was spray-painted across the side of the barn in large red letters, "Mind your own business." Robert emerged from the house as they pulled into the driveway, his face grim, but his posture suggesting controlled anger rather than defeat. "They hit us about 2 hours ago," he called out. 3 men in ski masks, professional operation. They knew exactly what they were looking for. What did they take? Chen asked, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of someone who'd investigated similar crimes. "That's the interesting part," Robert replied. "They tore the house apart looking for something, but as far as I can tell, nothing's missing. Sarah's evidence was with us at the courthouse, so they didn't get that." Margaret appeared in the damaged doorway, her face pale but her voice steady. They seemed more interested in sending a message than actually stealing anything. The leader kept asking where the teacher was and what she'd done with the other documents. Sarah felt a chill of realization. "They think I have more evidence than what I've already presented. They're looking for something I don't actually possess." Bradley looked up from photographing the damage. "Or they're looking for evidence of the larger network that they're afraid you might have discovered." Independently, Chen called for additional law enforcement support and crime scene investigators while the group tried to assess the full extent of the break-in. The message was clear. Sarah's investigation had identified threats to powerful interests, and those interests were prepared to use violence to protect their criminal enterprise. "This changes the timeline significantly," Chen said, after completing her initial assessment of the crime scene. "We can't wait for a methodical investigation. The corruption network knows they've been exposed, and they're moving to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. What do you recommend? Morrison asked. Immediate federal involvement, witness protection for key individuals, and coordinated raids to preserve evidence before it can be destroyed, Chen replied. Miss Mitchell, I need you to understand that your life may be in danger. These people have millions of dollars at stake and political careers to protect. Sarah looked around at the damaged ranch house where she'd found sanctuary and support, then at the faces of people who'd risked their own safety to help her fight for justice. The Ashford family had already paid a price for their integrity, and the cost would likely increase as the investigation proceeded. Deputy Chen, if I agree to federal witness protection, what happens to the investigation? Can it proceed without my testimony? Your evidence is crucial, but we have enough independent corroboration now to move forward, even if something happens to you, Chen said bluntly. The question is whether you're willing to see this through to the end, knowing the personal risks involved. Daniel stepped closer to Sarah, his presence offering support without pressure. Sarah, no one would blame you if you decided this was more than you bargained for. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could accept witness protection and disappear into anonymity, leaving others to fight the battle she'd started. Or she could stay and face whatever retaliation the corruption network might attempt, knowing that her testimony could be crucial for achieving justice. Deputy Chen, I have one question before I make my decision. If this investigation succeeds, how many children will benefit from recovered education funding and improved oversight of public finances? Chen consulted notes on her phone. Based on Mr. Bradley's analysis, we're looking at $2.3 million in recovered funds, plus whatever additional theft we uncover in other counties. That could mean new textbooks, updated facilities, and restored programs for thousands of students across rural Montana. The answer made Sarah's decision easy. She'd become a teacher because she believed education was the foundation of opportunity and democracy. If her courage now could protect educational resources for future generations, the personal risk was a price worth paying. I'm staying, Sarah said firmly. These criminals stole from children's education and subverted democratic processes. I won't let them escape justice because I was too scared to see this through. Chen nodded with obvious respect. Miss Mitchell, I admire your courage, but I want you to understand exactly what you're committing to. Once we announce federal charges against Senator Wells and her network, you'll become the most important witness in a case that could determine whether powerful political figures go to prison. As evening fell over the damaged AAA ranch, Sarah realized that her desperate fight for survival had evolved into something much larger. A battle for the integrity of Montana's democratic institutions and the protection of public resources meant to serve the common good. But she also understood that the corruption network would use every resource at their disposal to destroy her credibility, intimidate her supporters, and prevent the truth from being revealed. The real fight was just beginning, and the stakes had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first discovered those irregular consulting contracts in Cedar Falls. The FBI task force assembled in Cedar Falls moved with the precision of a military operation, coordinating simultaneous raids across 7 Montana counties at exactly 6 a.m. on a frigid Thursday morning in January. Sarah watched from the secure location where Deputy Attorney General Chen had relocated her as federal agents executed search warrants on the offices of Senator Patricia Wells, the shell companies identified in Bradley's investigation, and the homes of suspected conspirators throughout the state. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, had spent the previous week briefing Sarah on what to expect during the coordinated operation. Torres was a compact woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested decades of experience dismantling complex criminal organizations. The key to breaking conspiracy cases is simultaneous action. Torres had explained during one of their planning sessions. If we give them time to coordinate their responses or destroy evidence, they can often minimize the damage. But if we hit everyone at once, the weaker members usually crack and provide testimony against the leadership. From her secure location at a federal facility in Helena, Sarah monitored the raids through radio communications and live updates from task force members deployed across the state. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in Montana law enforcement history, involving over 60 federal agents, state investigators, and local law enforcement officers. Sarah, Agent Torres, called from the command center they'd established in the facility's conference room. We're getting reports of significant evidence recovery from Senator Wells' office. Financial records, communications with conspirators, and what appears to be detailed planning documents for expanding the shell company operations. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. Each piece of evidence recovered strengthened the case against the corruption network, but also increased the likelihood that desperate criminals would attempt violent retaliation against the witnesses who'd exposed them. Tom Bradley had been embedded with one of the raid teams, providing media documentation of the law enforcement operation while maintaining the confidentiality necessary for ongoing investigation. His preliminary report suggested the raids were uncovering evidence that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The financial records we've recovered show wire transfers totaling over $4 million, Torres reported, updating her assessment as evidence was catalogued. This operation was larger and more sophisticated than any of us initially realized. Daniel had volunteered to testify before the federal grand jury that would determine whether criminal charges should be filed. His family's ranch remained under protective surveillance, but they'd refused offers of relocation, choosing instead to maintain their normal routines while cooperating fully with the investigation. Agent Torres, Sarah said, studying the organizational chart the task force had developed, showing relationships between various conspirators. I noticed that several of the people being arrested today were involved in my original termination and harassment campaign. Is that significant legally? Extremely significant, Torres replied. Witness intimidation and retaliation are separate federal crimes that carry substantial penalties. The fact that they targeted you for exposing their crimes provides additional evidence of criminal intent and helps establish the conspiracy charges. Sheriff Morrison had proven instrumental in coordinating between federal agents and local law enforcement, despite the political pressure he faced from county officials who were uncomfortable with outside intervention in local affairs. His decision to support Sarah's investigation had been vindicated by the evidence, but had also made him enemies among the political establishment. The first major break in the case came when Marcus Ashford, faced with overwhelming evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. His detailed confession provided investigators with the organizational structure of the criminal network and the methods used to launder stolen public funds. Marcus has given us a complete roadmap of the operation, Torres announced during an afternoon briefing. He's identified the roles of each conspirator, the methods used to create and manage shell companies, and the political protection schemes that allowed the network to operate for years without detection. Sarah felt conflicted about Marcus's cooperation. While his testimony would be crucial for prosecuting the other conspirators, she couldn't forget that he'd been instrumental in orchestrating her professional destruction and had shown no remorse until faced with federal prison time. Deputy Attorney General Chen arrived at the secure facility with news that would reshape the entire investigation. Sarah, we've discovered evidence that this corruption network extends beyond Montana. Similar shell company operations have been identified in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Idaho, all apparently coordinated by Senator Wells' organization. The implications were staggering. What had begun as Sarah's discovery of local education funding irregularities had revealed a multi-state criminal enterprise that had stolen millions of dollars from rural communities. Across the American West, are we looking at federal RICO charges? Sarah asked, her understanding of the legal system having expanded considerably during her weeks of cooperation with law enforcement. RICO charges are almost certain, Chen confirmed. We have evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise, multiple predicate crimes across state lines, and a clear organizational structure designed to systematically defraud government programs. The media attention generated by the raids was intense and largely favorable to Sarah's position. Bradley's reporting had framed the story as a battle between grassroots integrity and institutional corruption, with Sarah portrayed as a courageous educator who'd risked everything to protect children's educational resources. But the coverage also brought unwanted scrutiny to Sarah's personal life and background. Television reporters camped outside the AAA ranch, seeking interviews with the Ashford family about their role in supporting the investigation. The attention was flattering but also invasive, making Sarah grateful for the security protection that kept her location confidential. "Agent Torres," Sarah said during one of their evening briefings, "what happens after the prosecutions? How do we prevent similar corruption networks from developing in other communities?" Torres considered the question thoughtfully. Successful prosecution sends a deterrent message, but real prevention requires systemic reforms in oversight and transparency. Your case has already prompted discussions about strengthening financial controls in rural government agencies. The breakthrough that sealed the case came when investigators discovered Senator Wells's private safe deposit box, containing detailed financial records that documented the full scope of the criminal enterprise. The records showed systematic theft from federal infrastructure programs, agricultural development grants, emergency services funding, and educational appropriations across multiple states. "These records are a prosecutor's dream," Chen announced after reviewing the safe deposit box contents. Wells kept meticulous documentation of every aspect of the criminal operation, apparently believing it would never be discovered. Margaret Ashford had emerged as an unexpected advocate for government transparency reform, using her position as a respected rancher's wife to speak publicly about the importance of citizen oversight of public finances. Her testimony before a state legislative committee investigating the corruption had been particularly powerful. "When criminals steal from education, they're stealing from our children's futures," Margaret had told the committee. "When they steal from infrastructure funding, they're stealing from our community's ability to grow and prosper. This isn't just about money. It's about the fundamental trust that makes democratic government possible." The psychological pressure on the remaining conspirators intensified as more members of the network agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Each new confession provided additional evidence against the leadership while revealing the sophisticated methods used to conceal the criminal activity. Robert Ashford had been appointed to a Citizens Oversight Committee, tasked with developing recommendations for preventing similar corruption in the future. His practical experience in ranch management and his family's role in exposing the Wells network made him a credible advocate for reform. "The key is transparency," Robert explained during one of the committee's public hearings. "When government finances are complex and opaque, criminals can hide their activities behind bureaucratic confusion. But when citizens can easily understand how their tax money is being spent, corruption becomes much harder to conceal." Senator Wells's arrest at her Helena office had been dramatic and widely covered by media outlets across the region. The sight of a powerful political figure being led away in handcuffs sent a clear message that no one was above the law when it came to stealing public funds. The evidence recovered from the coordinated raids filled multiple federal evidence rooms and required teams of forensic accountants to analyze completely. Each new discovery seemed to reveal additional layers of criminal activity that expanded the scope and duration of the conspiracy. Sarah, Agent Torres said during one of their final briefings before the grand jury proceedings, "I want you to understand the historical significance of what you've accomplished. This case has exposed the largest public corruption network in the history of the American West and will likely result in reforms that protect taxpayers for generations." Sarah felt pride in her role in exposing the corruption, but also profound sadness about the betrayal of public trust that had made the investigation necessary. Agent Torres, do you think this will really change anything in the long term? Or will new criminals just develop more sophisticated methods? Both probably, Torres replied honestly. But each successful prosecution makes the next one easier, and each reform makes corruption harder to conceal. You've struck a blow for integrity that will resonate far beyond Montana. The federal grand jury proceedings lasted 3 days, with Sarah providing detailed testimony about her initial discovery of the education funding irregularities and the systematic retaliation she'd faced for reporting them. Her testimony was corroborated by financial records, witness statements, and the confessions of cooperating conspirators. When the grand jury returned indictments against Senator Wells and 17 co-conspirators on charges including racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and witness intimidation, Sarah felt a sense of justice that had seemed impossible during her desperate weeks of homelessness. But even as the legal victory became clear, Sarah understood that the real measure of success would be whether the exposed corruption led to meaningful reforms that protected future generations from similar betrayals of public trust. The trials that would follow promised to be lengthy and complex, requiring continued cooperation from witnesses and sustained attention from media and public officials. Sarah had committed to seeing the process through to completion, knowing that justice required not just exposure of crimes, but accountability for their consequences. As she prepared for the next phase of legal proceedings, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a desperate homeless woman into a key witness in one of the region's most significant corruption cases. The personal cost had been enormous, but the potential benefits for democratic governance and public integrity made every sacrifice worthwhile. 2 years after the coordinated FBI raids that dismantled Senator Patricia Wells' corruption network, Sarah Mitchell stood before the Montana State Legislature as the newly appointed Director of Educational Integrity, addressing lawmakers about the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from her investigation. The transformation in her circumstances was remarkable, but more importantly, the systemic changes implemented across Montana had created lasting protections for public education funding. The courtroom victories had been decisive. Senator Wells received a 15-year federal prison sentence for racketeering and conspiracy charges, while her co-conspirators faced sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years. The recovered funds, totaling over $4.2 million after expanded investigations uncovered additional theft, had been returned to the communities that had been defrauded. The Mitchell Transparency Act, as the media had dubbed the legislation Sarah was presenting, required real-time public disclosure of all government consulting contracts above $5,000, mandatory citizen oversight committees for budget review, and criminal penalties for officials who retaliated against whistleblowers reporting financial irregularities. 2 years ago, I was sleeping in abandoned stables, destroyed professionally and personally for trying to protect children's educational resources, Sarah told the assembled legislators. Today, I'm here to ensure that no other educator or any citizen faces retaliation for exposing corruption that harms our communities. The Cedar Falls School District had undergone complete administrative restructuring following the convictions. A new superintendent, Dr. Patricia Morrison, had implemented transparent budgeting processes and restored the educational programs that had been cut to conceal the theft of funds. Test scores had improved dramatically once proper resources were available for classrooms. Daniel Ashford had been elected to the Cedar Falls School Board, running on a platform of fiscal transparency and educational excellence. His victory represented a symbolic changing of the guard from the corrupt officials who had controlled local politics for decades to a new generation, committed to honest governance. The most important lesson from this experience, Daniel explained during his inaugural school board meeting, is that ordinary citizens have both the power and responsibility to hold their government accountable. Sarah Mitchell's courage showed us what's possible when someone refuses to accept corruption as inevitable. The AAA ranch had become an unlikely symbol of integrity in Montana politics, with the Ashford family receiving recognition from numerous civic organizations for their role in supporting Sarah's investigation despite personal risk. Margaret Ashford had been appointed to the state's Ethics Advisory Committee, where she advocated for stronger protections for whistleblowers and clearer standards for public officials. Tom Bradley's reporting on the corruption case had won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism, but he continued working from his base in Helena to expose government corruption throughout the region. His follow-up investigations had identified and helped prosecute similar schemes in 3 other states, demonstrating that the Wells network was part of a broader pattern of rural corruption. Sarah's case became a template for investigating sophisticated financial fraud in small communities. Bradley explained during a journalism conference where he presented the investigative techniques that had exposed the multi-state conspiracy. The key was understanding that modern corruption often hides behind legitimate-looking paperwork that requires careful analysis to expose. Sheriff Kevin Morrison had been re-elected by the largest margin in Cedar Falls history, his support for the corruption investigation having earned him respect from voters who appreciated law enforcement officials willing to challenge powerful interests. His department had implemented new training programs for investigating white-collar crime and had become a model for rural law enforcement agencies. The federal reforms, prompted by the case, extended far beyond Montana. Congress passed legislation strengthening oversight of federal grants to rural communities and requiring enhanced reporting for all government consulting contracts. The changes made it significantly harder for future corruption networks to operate undetected across multiple jurisdictions. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been promoted to head the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for the Western region, largely based on her successful management of the Wells investigation. Under her leadership, the unit had developed new techniques for identifying shell company fraud and had successfully prosecuted corruption cases in 12 states. The Mitchell case changed how we approach rural corruption investigations. Torres explained during a law enforcement training seminar, "We learned that small-town corruption can be just as sophisticated as urban white-collar crime, and that citizen whistleblowers are often our most valuable source of initial intelligence." Sarah's personal transformation had been as dramatic as the systemic changes her courage had created. Her new position as Director of Educational Integrity came with significant responsibility for implementing and monitoring the transparency reforms across Montana's school districts. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying, allowing her to protect educational resources for thousands of children. Her relationship with Daniel had deepened over the 2 years of legal proceedings and recovery. They had married in a simple ceremony at the AAA ranch, surrounded by the law enforcement officers, journalists, and reform advocates who had become their extended family through the shared experience of fighting corruption. Sarah taught me that real courage isn't the absence of fear. Daniel said during their wedding reception, "It's doing what's right despite the fear, especially when the personal cost might be enormous." Her example changed not just our community, but our understanding of what ordinary citizens can accomplish when they refuse to accept injustice. The educational programs restored through recovered corruption funds had produced measurable improvements. in student outcomes across the affected school districts. New textbooks, updated technology, and expanded enrichment programs had given rural Montana children opportunities that the corruption had stolen from previous classes. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the new superintendent in Cedar Falls, had implemented innovative programs that became models for other rural districts. The resources we recovered through Sarah's investigation allowed us to create programs we'd only dreamed of before, she explained. But more importantly, the transparency requirements ensure that future administrators can't betray the community's trust in education, the citizen oversight. Committees established through the transparency legislation had proven remarkably effective at identifying potential problems before they became major corruption cases. Trained volunteers in dozens of Montana communities now regularly reviewed government spending and had already identified several instances of financial irregularities that were corrected before significant theft occurred. Margaret Ashford's work on the State Ethics Advisory Committee had led to the creation of a whistleblower protection program that provided legal and financial support for citizens reporting government corruption. The program had assisted over 30 individuals in the 2 years since its establishment, demonstrating the ongoing need for protection of honest citizens willing to expose wrongdoing. The most important reform isn't any specific law or regulation, Margaret explained during a civic engagement workshop. It's the cultural change that makes corruption socially unacceptable and celebrates citizens who have the courage to expose it. The media attention generated by the case had created lasting awareness of the importance of financial transparency in government operations. Editorial boards across the region regularly called for stronger oversight of public spending, and voters had shown increased willingness to support candidates who pledged transparency and accountability. Robert Ashford's Citizens Oversight Committee had developed training materials and procedures that were adopted by rural communities throughout the western United States. The practical approach to financial oversight that emerged from their work had proven effective for communities that lacked sophisticated auditing resources. Good government doesn't happen automatically, Robert observed during a presentation to rural civic leaders. It requires active citizen participation and vigilant oversight of how public money is spent. Sarah's case proved that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they're willing to act on their convictions. The psychological healing process had taken time for Sarah, who had suffered genuine trauma from the systematic destruction of her life and livelihood. Professional counseling and the support of the Ashford family had helped her process the experience and emerge stronger. But she remained aware of the lasting impact the ordeal had created. I learned that resilience isn't about being unaffected by adversity, Sarah reflected during a speech to education students at the University of Montana. It's about finding meaning in suffering and using that experience to create positive change that helps others avoid similar hardships. The broader impact of the case had extended to academic research, with several universities studying the investigation as a model for understanding how corruption networks operate and how citizen action can effectively challenge institutional wrongdoing. The case studies had influenced curriculum in public administration, criminal justice, and journalism programs. The long-term deterrent effect appeared to be significant. No major corruption cases had been discovered in Montana's rural counties since the Wells Network prosecutions, suggesting that the dramatic consequences faced by the conspirators had influenced potential criminals to avoid similar schemes. As Sarah concluded her presentation to the state legislature, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate homelessness to a position of influence in educational policy. The personal cost had been enormous, but the systemic changes achieved through her courage had created lasting benefits for Montana's children and communities. The choice I faced in those freezing stables was whether to give up or fight for what I believed was right, Sarah told the legislators. I chose to fight, and that choice led to reforms that will protect public education for generations. Every citizen faces similar choices when confronted with injustice. The question is whether we'll have the courage to act when action is needed most. The standing ovation that followed her presentation represented more than personal recognition. It reflected Montana's commitment to the transparency and accountability that Sarah's courage had made possible, and the understanding that democratic government depends on citizens willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the common good. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.